Welcome to the greatest debut albums in metal history, records released during the earliest stages of legendary bands that would later change the entire genre forever. In many cases, these albums didn't just launch careers, they shaped entire subgenres, influenced generations of musicians, and completely altered the evolution of heavy music itself. And here's the crazy part. Some of these debut albums are so good, fans still argue they're the peak of the band's entire career, nothing ever topping them again. That alone should tell you how important and how unbelievably strong the records in today's video really are. And like always, once you finish watching this video, I want you to leave your own favorite metal debut albums down in the comments. So with all that said, let's not waste any more time. This is Keep Metal, and welcome to another journey through 10 legendary debut albums in metal history.
Alice, it's frightening. Alice, aren't you scared? Alice, isn't it what?
Let's start with Alice in Hell by Annihilator, one of the greatest technical thrash debuts ever recorded during the final golden years of 80s thrash metal. Following the path of other important Canadian thrash bands, Annihilator entered the scene led by the unbelievable guitar virtuoso Jeff. But unlike more experimental Canadian bands like Voivod, Annihilator focused less on weird atmospheres and more on speed, precision, technicality, and riff mastery. Jeff Waters basically transformed technical thrash into something razor sharp, combining aggressive riffs with incredibly advanced guitar work. The entire album balanced sophistication and raw violence almost perfectly, which made Alice in Hell instantly stand out inside the thrash scene. And the craziest part is that Annihilator spent years trying to recreate the level of this debut without ever fully surpassing it. Alice in Hell remains one of the final, truly essential thrash masterpieces released during the 80s. Next, we have the explosive self-titled debut from W.A.S.P, a band that entered the American metal scene like absolute chaos. They immediately grabbed attention through two things: their shocking glam metal image and their much heavier traditional metal sound. Visually, they blended perfectly with the Sunset Strip scene next to bands like Mötley Crüe, Rat, Dokken, and Twisted Sister. But musically, W.A.S.P sounded far more aggressive, dirtier, and heavier than most glam bands exploding in America at the time. They mixed glam aesthetics with classic British heavy metal influences, creating a sound that felt dangerous and raw. That combination helped them become one of the most respected and successful bands of the entire glam metal movement. And this debut laid the foundation for the bigger success they would continue building with future albums. Then we arrive at Focus by Cynic, an album that genuinely sounded decades ahead of everything happening in extreme metal. And Paul Masvidal and Sean Reinert had already participated in the legendary Human album by Death before starting Cynic's debut. The jazz influence became much stronger in the drumming, the bass work, the guitar solos, and the overall structure of the songs. And then came the robotic vocoder vocals and guitar synthesizers, elements that sounded unbelievably experimental for extreme metal. Focus essentially helped establish the foundations for both technical death metal and progressive death metal at the same time. And honestly, even today, this album still feels futuristic compared to many modern progressive metal releases. The jazz influence became much stronger, especially in the drumming and the incredibly fluid guitar work. Sean Reinert's drumming sounded years ahead of its time, technical, precise, and unbelievably dynamic. But the most experimental element was definitely the robotic vocoder vocals used throughout the album. They also used guitar synthesizers, something almost unheard of in extreme metal during that era. Focus didn't sound like normal death metal, it sounded like death metal from the future. And because of that, the album became one of the essential foundations of progressive and technical death metal. Now let's talk about one of the most devastating thrash debuts ever released, The Legacy by Testament. At a moment when many Bay Area thrash bands were becoming more commercial or increasingly experimental, Testament returned to pure aggressive thrash. The Legacy sounded violent, sharp, fast, focused, and unbelievably hungry from beginning to end. A huge reason for that impact was because many of these songs had already existed for years before the album was finally recorded. At a moment when many Bay Area thrash bands were becoming more commercial or increasingly experimental, Testament returned to pure aggressive thrash. So instead of sounding inexperienced like many debut albums, the legacy felt incredibly refined and fully realized. The riffs were deadly, the solos exploded constantly, and Chuck Billy already sounded like a complete monster on vocals. Honestly, this is classic thrash metal operating at almost perfect level. Now we enter much darker territory with one of black metal's most legendary and infamous albums ever. De Mysterious Dom Sathanas became the official studio debut of the Norwegian band Mayhem. Even though the album released in 1994, parts of its composition dated back almost to the late 80s. The chaotic events involving Dead and Euronymous delayed the album and surrounded it with dark mythology. The result captured the primitive Norwegian black metal sound perfectly: raw production, thrash roots, and pure darkness. Now let's switch completely into power metal territory, because Avantasia arrived with one of the biggest debut statements of the 2000s. Tobias Sammet already had success with Edguy, but Avantasia was something much bigger and more ambitious. He created the project to unite legendary power metal singers and musicians into one giant fantasy metal opera. The Metal Opera Part 1 was recorded around 1999 and 2000, alongside the second part released later in 2002. And honestly, it had everything fans loved about German power metal: speed, melody, energy, and huge vocals. The choruses sounded massive, the arrangements felt epic, and the entire album had cinematic fantasy vibes. It immediately received incredible reviews and slowly became one of the most respected albums in the genre. For many fans, the Metal Opera Part 1 is still Avantasia's greatest release and one of metal's best debuts. But now let's move into something colder, darker, faster, and way more extreme. Children of Bodom. Something Wild dropped in 1997 and instantly shocked the extreme metal underground scene. The Finnish band mixed melodic death metal, black metal, and neoclassical metal into one chaotic combination. Alexi Laiho's guitar work sounded unbelievably technical while still staying catchy and melodic. The keyboards added atmosphere everywhere, creating a totally unique sound for the late 90s metal scene. Critics and Scandinavian metal fans immediately treated the album like a massive new arriver in extreme metal. The production wasn't perfect, but the songwriting quality was already insanely high for a debut release. Children of Bodom quickly became one of the biggest promises in extreme metal near the end of the century. And honestly, the legendary albums that came later only happened because this debut already showed enormous potential. Now let's jump into one of the most important glam metal debuts ever released, Too Fast for Love. Mötley Crüe basically helped define the entire Sunset Strip scene with this dirty and rebellious first album. The band's image became instantly iconic: wild makeup, leather, attitude, and pure rockstar chaos everywhere. But musically, the album still carried a lot of classic heavy metal and 70s hard rock energy. You can also hear strong punk rock influence in the speed, aggression, and raw attitude of the songs. The riffs were catchy, the chorus is huge, and Vince Neil still sounded hungry and energetic back then. Too Fast for Love introduced many early Mötley Crüe classics that fans still love decades later. And more importantly, the album helped launch one of the most iconic eras in 80s rock and metal. now we completely enter fantasy territory with one of power metal's most influential albums ever, Legendary Tales. Before Rhapsody arrived, power metal was melodic, but mostly centered around guitars and keyboards alone. Rhapsody transformed the genre by introducing massive orchestral and symphonic arrangements into the music. The band combined fantasy storytelling, medieval influences, speed metal energy, and huge cinematic atmosphere. Alex Staropoli, Luca Turilli, and Fabio Lione created something that sounded larger than life immediately. The album also started the famous Emerald Sword saga that continued across multiple future releases. And honestly, without Legendary Tales, symphonic power metal would probably sound very different today. Before the final main recommendation, here are 5 more legendary debut albums every metal fan should know. Metal Church by Metal Church. Heavy, aggressive, and massively influential for American power metal. Running Wild's Gates to Purgatory mixed speed metal with darker themes before the pirate era even started.
My mind is one, now has the crystal power. It's reaching back where my life.
Forbidden Evil by Forbidden delivered technical Bay Area thrash with incredible precision and speed. Omen's Battle Cry became one of the cult classics of traditional heavy metal and epic power metal. And Facelift by Alice in Chains helped open the doors for darker and heavier alternative metal in the 90s. But now, it's time for the final major recommendation of the entire video. Lightning to the Nations by Diamond Head remains one of the most important heavy metal debuts ever released. The album was independently released because of a complicated family-related situation surrounding the band. Even without massive label support, the record spread through the underground thanks to its incredible songwriting. The riffs sounded heavier and sharper than many traditional heavy metal bands of that entire era. That's exactly why bands like Metallica and Megadeth openly praised Diamond Head for decades afterward. You can hear the foundations of future thrash metal hidden inside many of those classic Diamond Head riffs. And honestly, it's still shocking how strong this band sounded on their very first major release. Sadly, many fans believe Diamond Head never fully reached this level of greatness again after the debut. And that's it, my people. Another chapter of legendary metal debut albums officially completed. Tell me in the comments which debut albums you would add to this list, because there are so many classics. I'll also leave previous parts of this series in the description and pinned comments below the video. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your metalhead friends, because real metal history deserves attention. And seriously, these albums prove how many bands reached legendary status right from the very beginning. Subscribe if you haven't already, and activate notifications so you don't miss future metal history videos. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok for extra content, recommendations, and more metal discussions. This was Keep Metal. Thank you for watching all the way until the end, and goodbye.